All right, let us get going. Welcome, one and all, to the Generation Squeeze dumpster fireside chat to stand up for pollution pricing and stall the momentum of Axe the Tax. My name is Paul Kershaw, and I am delighted to be joining you from, hey, come on, slides. Delighted to be joining you from the unceded ancestral territories of the Katzie people. And I encourage all of us to reflect deeply on the obligations we have to advance reconciliation in this country. As I do, I take particular inspiration today from the 7 generations principle, a principle common to many Indigenous peoples in Canada. And this principle rejects the short-term cynicism that dominates so much of Western politics. It demands that we take reasonable measures to prevent the present from colonizing the future, robbing it of opportunity, resources, and literally a planet fit for humans, all for the sake of our contemporary interests and convenience. I want to launch into our program by beginning to thank our expert guests who are joining us today, Melissa Lem and Grace Schaan. They're helping us to unveil our Pollution Pricing Posse toolkit. Melissa is the president of the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment, and she is a widely sought-after expert who regularly provides media commentary in print and radio and TV across the country. Grace is an expert with the Canadian Climate Policy Partnership and a recent grad of UBC, my institution, where she completed her master's thesis on carbon tax politics, political communication, and misinformation on social media. I'd also like to acknowledge our partners with whom we could not be having this event, along with my mom. As I prepared for this afternoon's event, I noticed she had registered to join, and my mom has long been an inspiration for me. And I really appreciate that she regularly models intergenerational solidarity by supporting all of the work that we do at Generation Squeeze. So thanks, Mom. Please notice that we've opened the Q&A function in Zoom where you can log any questions you may have that are arising as our session unfolds, and we will do our best to answer many of these in the second half of the program. We have scheduled our event to follow on the heels of the International Day for Intergenerational Fairness and to lend support from afar to the latest COP meetings at which our international leaders are discussing the present and future of our planet's health. And as we do so, we take some hope at Generation Squeeze that earlier this fall, the UN adopted its historic Declaration on Future Generations. And guided by that declaration, today we are proud to be launching our Good Ancestor Defense of Pollution Pricing. We're launching a quest. It's a quest to stand in the way of the Axe the Tax bandwagon by changing how Canadians talk about pollution pricing. You know, all quests, they have heroes we root for and villains we root against. And we are bringing you together to challenge politicians who propose to axe the carbon tax. And we are charging them with betraying Canada's kids. Simultaneously, we're appealing to Canadians, especially parents and grandparents, to be the heroes of the story by standing up for their kids in the world of politics and shouldering the responsibilities that this entails to be good ancestors. In today's event, we're going to share with you the theory of change that motivates our quest, the toolkit we've created to guide our journey, why others are keen to use that toolkit, and how you can join us in taking advantage of it too. That's how we'll make our quest a success. We share our theory of change because many who registered for today's event asked questions like Michael and Janet. Like Michael saying, how can we change the channel and get the majority of Canadians to strongly support carbon pricing? Or Janet asking, how can the message about harm for future generations become more mainstream? Well, our answer is simple. If we remind enough Canadians that we pay for our pollution to protect our kids, Then enough Canadian voters will eventually disapprove of politicians they judge to be betraying our kids, because most Canadians do not want politicians to sacrifice our children for their short-term political gain. In effect, our posse is calling on Canadians to stand up for a shared family value. If you make a mess, darn well clean it up. This principle, it's the bedrock, not just for carbon pricing, but for action on plastic waste, air and water pollution, and myriad other problems. We have to keep this principle on cultural life support no matter what the fate of carbon pricing after the next federal election. And indeed, keeping this family value alive in enough hearts and minds is our metric for success in our quest. Our target audience is the movable middle, not those who are dead opposed to carbon pricing on any terms. But let's remember that's only a third of Canadians. Let us also remember that we're starting with a posse that has 20% of Canadians who would never vote for a party that proposes to eliminate the carbon price on pollution. That's a whopping 6.4 million Canadian adults, which means we have plenty of allies. And now we need to mobilize those allies to reach the movable middle. The 16% who don't know what they think about pollution pricing, and the other 28% who aren't sure if the carbon tax really will shape their vote. We're going to focus on reaching that middle group, I should say, by reminding them why paying for our pollution is so darn important. Because it's necessary to protect our kids. So what does the movable middle want? Well, we have absolutely learned over the last 18 months that Axe the Tax proponents have shown that the movable middle wants affordability, and that they can be convinced that eliminating the carbon price will deliver that affordability, despite the evidence to the contrary. And this means that we are unlikely to renew support for a consumer price on carbon by delivering a math lesson on pollution costs versus rebates. We've already seen that it's too easy for opponents to poke holes in this narrative. Now, not because the evidence suggests that carbon pricing drives inflation, quite the opposite. Research from the University of Calgary and elsewhere shows that the carbon tax in Canada has added less than 1 cent for every dollar we spend on our major costs of living. But rather than debate affordability all the time, let's remember that affordability isn't all that this movable middle wants. Canadians are more than consumers, and research shows that the movable middle absolutely can be swayed by other values, another goal that they hold dear: to do right by our children, to protect our children, to punish those who would betray our children. And so these are the values and emotions that are motivating our quest. We will remind the movable middle that we pay for our pollution because we love our kids, and that politicians who suggest otherwise betray our children, asking our children to pay dearly for pollution that those politicians are unwilling to pay for today. Because there is no choice to pay or not to pay for our pollution. The only choice is to pay less for our pollution now and get a rebate, or burden our kids to pay more later. But later abuses the authority we wield over our kids. Since they can't vote, they are trusting us to do more, not less, to fight climate change. And that means urgently cutting smog and trash and paying for our pollution, present and past. At stake is nothing less than our legacy. Nobody's tombstone is going to read, "I'm proud I didn't pay for my pollution." But we might just write, "I tried to be a good ancestor," to preserve summers without smoke and winters in which our kids can ski, water that they can drink, and forests and wildlife with which they can live in awe. That is why we pay for our pollution. So, in response to JT and many others who ask what 3-word slogan can counteract the tax, our answer: be good ancestors. The moral of our story is, if you make a mess, clean it up, don't betray our kids. And sure, when we inevitably get dragged into talking about affordability, we will remind people that there are better ways to make life affordable, but there's no better planet to protect for our kids. That's the intent behind our Pollution Pricing Posse toolkit, available at this URL. There you will find info about our key messages, our conversation starters, responses to naysayers, visuals to share, and a whole bunch more. At bottom, we are asking all of you to pick an audience, choose a message from the toolkit, match that with a visual, and then share it. That is how you join our quest to stand up for our kids in the world of politics, by calling on our politicians to be good ancestors and not vandals who willfully damage the future with too little care for our kids. Which brings me to our dialogue now with Grace and Melissa, and I am going to stop sharing my screen for a moment to do just that. Splendid. Now, I'm seeing in the chat right now that Melissa has had an emergency and has stepped off, but we hope to bring her back. So I will start with Grace. Grace, you're a young person who has spent your scholarly career studying pollution pricing. And not only that, but pollution pricing comms. And so why are you keen to deploy the good ancestor narrative?
Yeah, well, thanks, Paul, for that great presentation that really highlights the key messages. So yeah, I just wanted to say that from my scholarly perspective, a lot of what my research has shown is that politicians who share messages such as axe the tax, they're also sharing messages with people that really target their values. And we've seen that this is working because people are buying into the axe the tax messaging. And so some of the things that they are telling people is that the tax is going to make, you're not gonna be able to buy groceries for your kids. You're not gonna be able to take your kids to play hockey. And this triggers really emotional responses from people that target their values. And basically what some of the key messaging that you just explained, Paul, does the exact same thing. It targets people's values, and so it triggers like emotional responses that can lead to action, can lead to change of opinion. And so, yeah, this tapping into emotions instead of emissions, it can work in the same
That's a nice
way.
phrase. I haven't heard that one before. Tapping into emotions, not emissions. I'm going to borrow that one for sure.
But yeah, it works the same way in reverse, that highlighting the way that this is affecting not just them, but their kids, the things that's important to people. A lot of Canadians care about their families. And so highlighting that message makes it clear that carbon pricing, like we're not paying this just for helping some island nation on the other side of the world in some distant future. It's helping them, their family, their kids right now. Because of course, Melissa will get into what the impacts are for our kids. Yeah, so
Okay, that's great. And that's a lovely segue to Melissa, who I'm delighted is back and I see on screen right now. Thank you so much for being here. Melissa, as a family doc, how do the problems caused by pollution, how do they betray our kids? When you hear me use that language, what do you have in mind? What do you think?
Well, Paul, first of all, apologies for being late. Technical difficulties. Obviously, I need a younger kid to help me with my Zoom platform. But let me count the ways pollution betrays our kids. So the truth is that the climate crisis is a children's health crisis. And it was 5 years ago, almost to the day this month, that The Lancet, which is one of the world's oldest and most prestigious medical journals, released its annual country-by-country global health report called The Lancet Countdown, that focused on the idea that every child born today will be affected by climate change. And if we don't take effective measures to reduce our carbon pollution now, that within their lifetimes, they will face a world 4 degrees warmer than pre-industrial times. And there was another recent study in the journal Science, which said that a child who was 6 years old in 2020 compared to someone born in 1960 would experience twice as many cyclones and wildfires, 3 times as many extreme floods, 4 times as many crop failures, and 5 times as many droughts. And we're already seeing those devastating effects on children's health in real time now. And from a personal perspective, as a physician, during the 2021 heat dome, we know here in BC, 619 people died in 1 week, which was the worst weather-related mass casualty event in the history of Canada. And I remember seeing more cases of heat illness than I ever had in my entire career, from kids to adults with headaches and heat rash and dehydration and heat stroke. And not only that, but the entire VSB, Vancouver District School Board, canceled classes during the last week of school. This is the first time it had ever happened due to heat, because of how dangerous the heat would be in uncooled buildings, like the majority of buildings in the Lower Mainland at the time. So here I was, unable to sleep because it was 35 degrees Celsius or higher in my own home because I didn't have air conditioning, trying to work as a doctor, field media interviews, and take care of my kid, who was 5 years old at the time, who I had to check on multiple times overnight because I was worried that he would get heat stroke. And then this on top of the asthma exacerbations and mental health problems I see every summer now during what we now call smoke season in BC. And if we kick the can of paying for our own pollution down the road to our kids, we will see major consequences for their health and our healthcare system. The Canadian Climate Institute estimated that within 25 years, if we don't reduce our carbon pollution now, that climate change will cost our healthcare system an additional $110 billion per year. And if you think you have access to key issues now, just wait if we have to pay for even more health system effects of climate change on top of that. And one more thing I want to mention, which are the real health impacts of the fossil fuel industry, which, as we know, is driving climate change, is having on children's health in communities where those fossil fuels are being extracted right now. Whether it's air pollution from fossil fuels that kills 1 in 7 people in Canada every year, that's a big number, 1 in 7 people. And in children worsens asthma, affects pregnancy outcomes, and impairs development, or those local health impacts of fossil fuel extraction. We have a huge generational justice issue right now. Hydraulic fracturing or fracking is the process in BC that generates the vast majority of natural gas, and it's been linked to higher rates of childhood leukemia, asthma, congenital defects, and premature birth. And we know that kids who are living in communities where fossil fuels are being extracted are going to experience a double whammy of health harms that set them up for a lifetime of illness on top of the long-term health effects of climate change. It's incredibly unfair. And to be clear, this is a choice that we're making to harm our kids' health, because we have all the solutions we need to rapidly transition to a clean energy economy, pollution pricing, emissions caps, renewable energy technology that's now cheaper than any other form of energy production. I'm just going to say it one more time. When we don't take effective action and uphold regulations like pollution pricing to fight climate change, this is a choice we're making to harm our children's health.
Well, the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment is one group that's really leading the charge to encourage Canadians to make a different choice. How do you see the good ancestor narrative, intersecting with some of the comms activities that are underway right now at CAPE?
Well, it's a really compelling one for essentially every issue we advocate around health and the environment, because all of them involve working to stop and reverse changes to our climate and ecosystems that will affect our children's health for generations, because protecting the planet's health means protecting our children. And I'm going to give you some examples along with the BC fracking example I already mentioned. We helped get Bill C-226, a national strategy respecting environmental racism and environmental justice act, passed this year.
Congratulations.
And thank you. It was a big coalition effort. But this environmental racism means that, for example, CAPE board member and Indigenous Physicians Association of Canada president, Dr. Ogista Horn, who's a Mohawk woman and family doctor who works on the Akwesasne Reserve that straddles the borders of Ontario, Quebec, and New York, is seeing abnormally high rates of cancer and cognitive issues in adults who were once children, who were exposed to PCBs and lead and mercury in the late 20th century because of widespread industrial pollution, and they didn't care about what Indigenous peoples would be exposed to them. And today we have the risk of that sleeping giant of toxins being woken up again because of the potential for, this is very complicated, but the potential for clean hydroelectricity on the St. Lawrence River that's attracting new industries to these sites, which means that kids who live on the reserve today will likely be experiencing the same health outcomes, as their parents when they're adults. And then another example is CAPE's campaign to ban fossil fuel advertising. We had a major win when we helped get C59 passed this June, which contained very effective anti-greenwashing legislation in it. We saw many, fossil fuel organization company websites go blank. And we're working right now to try to get Bill C372, Charlie Angus's private members bill, to ban fossil fuel advertising to pass second reading in the next couple of months. And we know that kids in particular, whether it's in schools or everyday advertising in their communities or online, are highly susceptible to misinformation and disinformation that pushes them and their parents to make choices that are at odds with a healthy future. The World Economic Forum, I know, has mixed reviews among certain quarters, but anyway, releases an annual global risk report, and this year their number one risk globally, according to all these surveyed industry, academic, and community leaders, is misinformation, and our kids will be paying the price for it now and in the decades to come. And one last point is, coming back to this conversation, CAPE has supported a federal price on pollution from the beginning, whether it was our advocacy with EcoFiscal highlighting its health and economic benefits, or speaking at a press conference with then Environment Minister Wilkinson, celebrating when the Supreme Court of Canada upheld the constitutionality of carbon pricing. The need to protect our kids is a really compelling argument we haven't necessarily been making in support of this. We saw BC's Premier David Eby backtrack on his support for pollution pricing this September, despite all the economic and health arguments behind it. So I think it's really time for a new and effective narrative.
Mm-hmm. Well, it doesn't surprise me that CAPE's leading the charge on trying to take on advertising as it relates to the fossil fuel industry, because of course the medical profession was played such a big role in fighting tobacco and tobacco advertising. There's such an interesting parallel there. And I love that you remind us that CAPE was such a key player in going all the way to the Supreme Court to defend the constitutionality of putting a price on pollution. That's something we actually did in tandem together. And that was one of our favorite collaborations with CAPE over time. Grace, can I bring it back to you for a minute? When we've been coming up with our 3-word response to axe attacks, be good ancestors, one of the risks I think about our strategy is that it definitely welcomes in grandparents, it welcomes in parents, but what about people who don't yet have kids that they're thinking about being good ancestors for? You've been musing about how best to deploy some of our messaging in the toolkit. How do you navigate that angle?
Yeah, so being in my mid to late 20s myself, and I don't have kids, I see this messaging and the toolkit as really something that can be deployable by anybody to anybody. So first of all, it's pretty simple. It's simple to understand that when you make a mess, you clean it up, and if you don't, the next people have to do so, and it costs more. So you don't have to be an expert to use this messaging, or be an expert to understand it either. You don't need to know how the technical details of the carbon tax work to be able to make this argument. Yeah, and another thing is that I think it can be intimidating as a young person to speak up to people of an older generation. One, just because I'm thinking about the holidays coming up, going home to see older family members.
Grumpy uncles.
And what happens if somebody says something that I know isn't true about the carbon tax? It can be intimidating to talk to older people about this, especially if you want, if you don't want to get into a political debate with your grandpa at Christmas or whatever. And the great thing about this messaging is it's nonpartisan. Basically, it supports any party that wants to further a price on pollution. And yeah, we have parties from both sides of the spectrum who are opposing the carbon tax right now. So using this frame can help avoid getting into some kind of a political debate, keep it neutral. You don't have to worry about any negative repercussions. So I think that makes it more accessible for young people to take a leap, especially those who aren't experts in the field.
Well, we definitely designed the toolkit so that we don't have to become experts in tax policy or know the ins and outs of the particular system we have here versus any of other range of pricing pollution systems elsewhere. I kind of like that you observe that at bottom, we really are trying to just have people remind one another about this family value, that if you make a mess, clean it up. And we're not entirely sure how that conversation around a intergenerational gathering for Thanksgiving, if you're American, or other holidays coming up in December. But I'm really excited to hear how you and others find just like, hey, when we make a mess, why don't we have an obligation to clean it up? We teach that to our kids all the time. Why would we abandon that when it comes to our pollution?
Definitely. And I think something else that I hear from a lot of older people say who work in fields that are like highly polluting, which that's like a sensitive topic as it is. They talk about, oh, well, I want to make sure that my kids get the same experience that I did, and they get to reap the same rewards of like living in this area. And like you can say the exact same thing in reverse. Like, yeah, don't you want your kids to experience the same things you got to experience and benefit the same way that you did? And how do you do that? You pay for your pollution and you leave your kids a healthy planet.
Well, that's beautifully said. Maybe my last observation / question to both of you is, when I think about the momentum of X, the tax, I'm not entirely convinced that the momentum is just about a particular tax policy, the consumer price on carbon. I think there's something much bigger at stake right now where, to some degree, a group of politicians are saying, hey, right now, we don't have to feel obliged to take action more generally to protect the planet's health for those who follow in our footsteps, because other things are hard. And I worry that that is the broader issue at stake. So when people say, like, why do we want to stand up for the price on pollution right now? It's not only because evidence shows it's one of the best, if not the best measures to, organize a whole constellation of tools around, but that we're fighting over this bigger principle that we have to urgently take action now. How do my musings there resonate with your own thinking on the issue? First to you, Melissa.
Sure. I'm going to talk from my perspective as a healthcare professional. So I'm a family doctor. I have my own practice in Vancouver. I do rural medicine. I do rural emergency work. And where we are at, we're in this kind of low resource environment, artificially low resource environment, where we apparently only have so much we can do to take action on climate. And so I've had this experience where, where I'm in a low resource environment in an ER, and when a patient's vital signs are crashing, we use every single tool in the toolbox we have to save that patient's life. And in the same way, we can see the planet's vital signs crashing around us. That we're on track to being the hottest year in human history. And the ability of our healthcare system to take care of us is also crashing along with the planet's vital signs. So it from a healthcare perspective, it makes absolutely no sense to me to stop pollution pricing, which, as you mentioned, Paul, is a measure we know is effective and very efficient. In addition, with other measures, obviously, they're quite important too,
Yes.
to reduce our carbon pollution. If we want to be the adults in the room, if we want to be the heroes of the story, we need to use every measure we have to protect our kids' health, and pollution pricing is one of them.
Grace, over to you, and then I think I'm going to start segueing to take some of the questions that we've collected from people earlier in the registration and through today's session.
Yeah, just to echo what Melissa said, we don't have time to waste, and we are already falling short of our emissions reductions targets, even with these policies in place. We definitely don't have time to undo the progress that we've made and all the years we've spent trying to implement this. It's been decades already. But yeah, it's not like it's some magic silver bullet policy. It's not meant to act alone. That's why we have a whole portfolio of other policies that work in sync with carbon pricing. However, yeah, so it's one of our heavy hitters. We need to keep it. We need to add to our portfolio instead of stripping it apart. And another thing I just want to point out, or why can't we give up on the pollution price, is because it's already making people's everyday lives better, and we can't take that away from people. We know that it has led to electric vehicles becoming cheaper, led to faster innovation for renewable energy that can outcompete fossil fuels. It's making our air cleaner. It's making our kids healthier. We can't just eliminate that.
Well, that is a lovely way to wrap up the first half of our session today. And I'm going to invite Jennifer my lovely colleague Jennifer Fox to come online. I think, Jennifer, you've been organizing some of the hundreds of questions that people were supplying when registering and keeping track of what's happening in the Q&A better than I am. Can you share with us a question? Oh, but you're muted, my friend.
Sorry, guys. Yeah, there's no lack of questions, that's for sure. A lot of them are questions that I think our wonderful toolkit can answer. So I'm thinking, Paul, maybe we could walk through that. You can share your screen, but I'll just start with this first one from Marianne, who asks, how do we talk to conservative people? So given that our values, beliefs, and priorities may not totally align with one another, as Grace so wonderfully pointed out, how do we start talking with these people in a respectful way, in a way that gets to their thinking? We had another question that was very similar around how do we talk to working class people? Because probably a lot of us on the call today are, have higher levels of education, are more interested in politics, and have more experience. So how do we get to these people? And then how do we also identify those movable middle people that we are trying to target? Because we're not trying to go exactly towards the far right conservative. We're trying to identify that movable middle.
Yeah, great. Can people see now the website up with the Pollution Pricing Posse toolkit? Can one of my team members, does anybody? Thank you very much, Grace. I appreciate that confirmation. There's several questions there. Maybe Grace and Melissa, you percolate for a moment. I'll jump in on one and then welcome you to weigh in on some of the others. I said earlier on in my opening remarks that our target audience is not the third of Canadians who polling suggested is dead opposed to carbon pricing. That doesn't mean, though, that we're not wanting to engage with those who would align center-right and often these days be open more to voting for the Conservative Party of Canada or their comparable party at a provincial level. Indeed, if you look at a lot of the themes that we're emphasizing in our Good Ancestor Toolkit, we are borrowing from a range of communications research that encourage us to tap into themes that are quite strong on the right of center. So you hear what our language is kind of loyalty to our kids and not betraying our kids. This language of loyalty and betrayal is a strong right of center value, more common amongst conservative-minded folks than you might see on the farther left to center. Similarly, when we think about, if you make a mess, clean it up, this idea that we have personal responsibility to take action to deal with the consequences of our choices. That notion of personal responsibility is really common in right of center narratives. And also you'll hear us about us wanting to be good ancestors, to be protecting what's so sacred for those who follow in our footsteps, like this healthy planet on which not only their livelihoods, but their health, as Melissa so eloquently articulated, depends. And this notion of the sacred is absolutely something that is a dominant right of center theme. So in those ways, we have set out to target the movable middle, but doing so in some regards to some of the very themes and norms of values that are held really dearly and rightly so on the right of center. And so that is a big part of our strategy in this quest. Grace or Melissa, on some of the other questions, any insights maybe to you, Melissa, first?
Sure. I think that question gets to the heart of why we're having this conversation, which is using frames and approaches that resonate across more than just the left. And so you mentioned protecting our kids, pollution, betrayal, loyalty. These are really important frames. But what's also a really important frame, and I'm not saying this because I'm biased, I'm saying this because it's backed up by research, is that health actually. Yes. Health is a really important and effective frame to get people to support policy proposals across political spectra. So there's a lot of research around it. I want to zero in on one particular study that was published, peer-reviewed and published just a couple of years ago. And it looked at 5 different countries, middle to high income countries, with over 7,500 participants. And they gave them different frames around certain policy proposals that dealt with climate action, and then asked them which of those 2 frames would be most effective to get them to support those policy proposals. Health framing actually came out right on top as the most effective framing to get people to support those policy proposals. Opportunity framing, so these are all the positive things that will happen if we put these in place, was more effective than threat framing. And then also, interestingly, focusing on present impacts was more effective than focusing on future impacts, even though both did improve framing and improve support, and among people actually who weren't concerned about climate change. So this speaks to kind of people more maybe center right or right. Health framing and opportunity framing were the only frames that worked for them to support those policy proposals. So none of the other ones. So environmental framing actually worked, for the general public as well, but health and opportunity were the only ones. So we have to think about messaging for people in general. What's going to bring in the largest audience? Care for our kids. Health benefits are very powerful frames that we can use to build support for this important tool.
And so I think one of the questions that Jennifer shared was like, how do we find those movable middle people? I think, Melissa, you and I are partly saying if we share these themes that kind of cut across the ideological spectrum, we will then attract those who are in the movable middle to engage on those themes with us. But I wonder, Grace, given that you did your master's thesis on carbon pricing, politics, and comms and misinformation, do you have any other insights you might share, especially in terms of like, how do we identify who we should be talking to?
Yeah, I think that, just in our own social networks, we all probably know people who might be in the movable middle or they're further in the opposite direction. And I know that people tend to listen to people that they trust, and often that's your family, that's your friends, or like Melissa, that's your family doctor. And so I think it's about having ordinary conversations with the people that you know, and asking these questions about, oh, you don't think we should price pollution? Like, why? Like, try to understand why. And then the other thing is that, yeah, okay, this one is going to be more for people in the political sphere, but we might have some of those people with us today. But something that I found in my master's thesis was there was, in the sphere, in this example, it was on Twitter, but there was this whole conversation of Axe the Tax, and nobody was talking about supporting the carbon price. It was a completely absent point of view from the conversation. So even just voicing it to your friends and family, that you actually do support a price on pollution, that's adding a different side to the narrative. And then of course, there are more kinds of like leaps you can take, which I believe some of them are also outlined in the toolkit, and some of those are using your social media following. I personally email my elected officials all the time to share my opinion, and recently it's been to tell them that I support a price on pollution. It doesn't mean you're going to hear back from them. But yeah, those are a couple things.
I think it's really important that you observed that there's something happening at this moment where the momentum of Axe the Tax has grown so much that I think there's a sense out there that, oh, not many people actually support any longer the price on pollution, which is why I did share early on in my opening remarks that figure from Abacus polling, which shows, sure, there are about a third of Canadians who are like definitely going to be motivated to vote against a price on pollution right now. But there are also at least 20% of Canadians who are like, no, I'm going to vote against a party that's not willing to keep it. And those numbers aren't that different yet. And so I think it's important right now for us to be stepping up and reminding Canadians that there's a big chunk of us that really support the idea. And it wasn't that long ago we had a consensus. We had a majority of support from Canadians thinking we need to put a price on pollution. And we had every single party at the federal level that's an official party saying they agree. So it wasn't that long ago that we had consensus. And I think that's the incremental win that we're hoping to slowly but surely achieve with launching our firm stand for pricing pollution with our new posse that's joined us here today. Jennifer, we have time for another round of questions.
Yeah, it's great. We've had this question more than once and even talked about it as a team at Generation Squeeze. But why are we using the term pollution pricing instead of specifically carbon tax?
Oh, I had strong feelings on that one. I'll say my short answer quickly. You know, we're coming in here wanting to emphasize that framing matters and what are different ways to talk about important themes with our friends and neighbors and family. And, you know, Canadians have been socialized for a range of reasons to not feel all that excited about tax. You know, death and taxes are a phrase that we sometimes put together. So the ability to talk about pollution pricing as a tax can automatically get Canadians to lean in with some negativity. But the language of a price on pollution is reminding, like, why are we doing this? You know, pollution can't be free. If we make a mess, we should pay to clean it up. And so we are wanting to hold firmly to that concept of pollution pricing so that we don't cede the frame. But we know that when our posse joins our quest and they go out there to talk about the importance of paying for our pollution, they're going to run into people like, what do you mean? And you might have to pivot into like, well, we're talking about the debate about the carbon tax. But we want to be careful to always cede the frame to those who are opponents, because the framing really does matter. And just as, you know, those who are opposed to carbon pricing right now, they're like, axe a tax because that's going to solve our affordability problems. The evidence does not support that. Again, like less than 1 cent of every dollar of our major costs of living is being influenced by the price on pollution. So even once we axe the tax, we're gonna have a lot of affordability challenges that still frustrate people. If only we could get our elected officials who are opposed to the price on pollution to acknowledge as much, we could make more headway on our wallet issues than we are currently. Melissa or Grace, any other reasons to why we should, you know, talk about a price on pollution and not the carbon tax? Or maybe you disagree and say, Paul, just own the carbon tax.
I feel kind of neutral because sometimes I use the word carbon tax when I'm talking about a specific policy. But I think what's great about pollution pricing is two things. I think pollution is a lot more tangible for a lot of people to think about than emissions, which people can't see. So pollution is like something more visual maybe for people to realize. And that the second thing is it can include anything that is polluting our environment, not just carbon. So.
I'm gonna back up that idea you have, Grace, which is, I think if people realize, and I just touched on it during my earlier remarks, how much the air pollution from combusting fossil fuels is harming our health right now, our children's health, our prenatal health, elders' health. There's almost no health system that pollution from combusting fossil fuels doesn't touch and doesn't harm. And I think if we use this term pollution, we can start, and people ask, they might say, oh, you know, why are you calling it pollution pricing? Just like, you know, one of the participants did, and not the carbon tax. And you can start to describe the many ways that carbon, not carbon, but anyway, but that burning fossil fuels pollutes our atmosphere, warms our climate, and also harms our health tangibly, directly right now, over and above just climate change.
You know, Melissa, I saw you just sort of did a self-check on like, well, carbon in our air. And I wonder if to some degree you were referencing how recently in Alberta, the provincial government or the party that makes up the provincial government passed a resolution making the case that carbon is an essential part of life. And as a result, I think they're trying to make the case that it's somehow, you know, how can something that's essential for life be pollution? And it's been making me think of like, well, like water is essential to life, but when there's too much water concentrated in the wrong place, we call it a flood and it's a disaster to people. So just in the same way, when there's too much carbon concentrated in the wrong place, we call it like causing climate change and extreme weather, and it's a disaster for people. And so I wondered, is that what were you trying to catch yourself in that level of precision?
That may have been playing in the back of my mind. So I was trying to be consistent with how we call it. But I do in my everyday, you know, when I talk about this, I do say carbon pollution a lot. Yeah, I'm going to keep using that term because I think people need to know that it is in excessive amounts, like you said, pollution.
And, you know, in some regards, our quest on the one hand is a bit quixotic that we're wanting to slow the momentum of Axe the carbon tax, but we actually have a longer term ambition, which is to really contribute to a tax shift where more and more we're paying for all kinds of pollution. We pay more for our plastic pollution, our water pollution, our carbon pollution, and then we reduce taxes in other ways. And we start to collect income more by taxing what we don't want a lot of. And then we can actually release the pressure on taxing things that we do want more of, like, you know, middle incomes and better incomes for people who right now might be struggling with low income and poverty. Another question, my friend Jennifer, and that might, depending on time management, this might be our last round. We'll see if we can squeeze another in.
Yeah, there's actually quite a few questions coming in about naysayers. So what can we do to address the people that are claiming that climate change is a natural progression like the ice age? What can we say to people that are saying that, well, Canada is such a small country and we have so few people and our emissions aren't really that, it's a drop in the bucket compared to other big polluters like China. And conveniently enough, we do have a bunch of these already answered on our toolkit website. So just a reminder that if you go to gensqueeze.ca /posse, you will be asked to sign up to be one of our posse members. And that is how you will access the toolkit. And Paul, maybe you can just walk us through this.
Yes, so I have been
section.
trying to be Vanna White to your narrative right there and draw attention to some of the responding to naysayer options that we've already created in anticipation of those kinds of questions. You can, for instance, click on taxes won't reduce carbon pollution because taxes don't change the weather. But pollution absolutely does. And so we have a lot of that kind of language. And if you'll be looking for it's China and India that are, big aggregate emitters of pollution. This is one of those naysayer things that actually does rile me on a regular basis, because when we look at the data about which individuals on this planet are big polluters, Canadians are routinely at the very, very top in terms of our per capita emissions. And how can we go and say to individuals in countries around the world where they individually are polluting so much less than us that they have to step up and change their behavior, but because we're a small population in total, that kind of relieves us of the responsibility to do so. So you'll find that kind of language. You can then click on, hey, I'm done with that issue, and say, well, we often hear, but wait a second, aren't industries with big profits and bigger carbon footprints, don't they need to pay their fair share? And you'll find language that absolutely says, you bet they do. And none of us want to be sort of duped into thinking that we have to pick up all of the weight to carry in terms of reducing our carbon pollution, while big emitters and companies do profiteering from it. And so we have that kind of language for you. But at the same time here, this is one place where we do share a hard truth that I just did summarize a moment ago, that everyday Canadians are also big emitters by international standards when thinking about it at the individual level. So those are some examples. You can close it up, then you can choose another one. Again, a carbon tax and won't make a difference to global emissions. We're covering that theme. You can see more language, and we arm you with a ready-made answer to bring to the conversations to some degree that Grace was anticipating in her earlier remarks, maybe over the holiday season. And there's just a fine balance here. On the one hand, we hope we give you enough information that if you want to take on some of the more technical details to debate, then great. But at the same time, we've given a frame, a communication tool that allows people to just sort of pivot, like, look, we can talk about these details, and the difference between what's happening in China or India or Canada or elsewhere. But what about this idea? If you make a mess, you should clean it up. Don't you teach your kids that? And if you teach your kids that in one setting, why would we not think about it being important in another, in this one? Grace or Melissa, want to add anything to that?
I think you covered it, Paul.
The other part of the toolkit, Paul, that we want to draw people's attentions to is the different audiences that we want to engage. So we do have some messaging on here that would be useful when you're talking to politicians versus when you're talking to people on social media. And so one of the actions you can take is to actually write a letter to your politician.
Oh, I'll do that one. I'll be a better Vanna. Keep talking.
So the menu at the very top will lead us to thanking pollution price defenders or writing an op-ed and a letter to the editor. So in the pollution price defenders part, we have identified our top 5 list of defenders, and they happen to be the Liberals and the Green Party. who continue to defend a price on pollution. We also encourage people to visit the Government of Canada website, where they can access all the other MPs that are doing great work on this as well. And then we get into our social media graphics and our templates.
Okay.
For social media, we've got memes up there, funny videos. So what you have to do is go to gensqueeze.ca/posse and sign up with your email, and then you'll get access to this toolkit. And we will be checking in with everybody in a week or so with an email blast out to everyone to see how you're doing, see if you need any support along the way. You can always contact us. And hopefully we'll be doing another call like this early in the new year, just to check in with our posse members and talk about next steps.
Great. Well, I'm conscious of the time, and I know that I'm going to take 3 or 4 minutes to kind of wrap us up. So I wonder, is there one last question we want to squeeze in? And I'll let Grace and Melissa have the floor to answer.
We did have one from Jay that asked, are there any home run simple truths supporting carbon pricing that's as catchy as Axe the Tax? Would there be any benefit in packaging our complicated answers into more simple, digestible forms?
Well, I feel like that question sort of anticipates the entire purpose of our meeting today and the entire toolkit. I'm not, I think it's a debatable question whether or not our Be Good Ancestors will be sufficient to rival the poetry of Axe the Tax. But I think that the overall power of our narrative, that we, be good ancestors, the moral of our story is clear. If you make a mess, clean it up. If you don't, you're betraying our kids. And then when we are drawn into talking about affordability, that's inevitable, but ultimately remind people there are better ways to solve our wallet problems, but there's no better planet to save for our kids. So that simple set of messages is, I think, something that people can leave with today, and begin sharing in their social media, begin sharing with their friends. And Grace and Melissa, to you for 30 seconds each to wrap that up as I switch back to my slides.
I think a lot of great comments have been made. Really excited to have been part of this call. Thank you everyone for joining. And I just keep remembering, keep that health frame front of mind, build those relationships, because I find even with people who might not necessarily agree with you, when they realize that it depends on the person, but when you're coming from a place that's backed up by evidence, by research, and by genuine care for that person, and your community, that it makes it easier to listen. And don't expect, one other thing I want to say is, don't expect them to change their mind right in front of you. There's a lot of pride, I think, and a lot of ego that goes with holding on to beliefs that you had, even when you start to realize that you're wrong. So don't be afraid to follow up with people afterwards. Keep having those conversations in relationship and see if their mind has changed, or if they may have more questions. Don't see it as like a one and done process. Keep going back to the well and seeing how you can change minds and hearts.
Yeah, that's a great point, Melissa. And I think another thing that this whole conversation has reminded me of was a conversation I had with a city staff member who is in charge of like climate policies for their municipality. And something they said to me, we were kind of talking about why does your municipality have a lack of climate policies, and like what's going on here? Why can't we get anything going? And their answer was, well, nobody asked for it. And I just thought that was like a great reminder that we have to ask for what we want. And in this case, we actually did get what we asked for, but we need to keep asking for it, because if not, it's gonna go away. So.
Yeah, we need to keep asking for what we got. We need to defend what we got. That's really critical. So let me end on that. How can each of us focus on coming together to fight the Axe the Tax dumpster fire, to defend this price on pollution that we asked for and did receive? You know, we know we are stepping into the fray where there is bound to be anger and resistance, and where many actually have already judged that it's a lost cause to defend the consumer price on pollution. And in such moments, I think we can all be reminded of the wisdom of Gimli in Lord of the Rings. So if you'll permit me just a few seconds to play his clip.
Certainty of death, small chance of success. What are we waiting for?
So there you have it. We are going to have not the same challenges of certainty of death, but we are certainly going to run into people who are, frustrated with the price on pollution. And nevertheless, what are we waiting for to jump in and stand up for this essential climate policy? One that ensures that if we continue to pay for our pollution, we won't betray our children. So here are clear calls to action. Try the toolkit with at least one message and one audience. We're hoping each of you will invite another person in your network to use the toolkit. We're then going to ask you to be in touch with us by email, specifically my lovely colleague, Jennifer, who you've all met today at jennifer@gensqueeze.ca, and share with us some of your early experiences with the toolkit, including recommendations you may have to improve it, because it's intended to be an evergreen document, one that we plan to update periodically. For those of you who are creative, we hope that you might build your own visuals and memes so that we can crowdsource content together. And we will have a $100 gift certificate to award for the best example of a meme that someone creates in the weeks ahead that we intend to award at our next gathering in early 2025. And so our last ask of you will be to join us again, likely late in January, where we'll reconvene to talk about next steps in our quest and early experiences along the way. Now you can see my notes so that I don't even need to narrate it, but let me say in closing, let us all be remembered as good ancestors. Let's pay for our carbon pollution, our plastic pollution, our water pollution. Let's pay for all of our pollution so we have reason to pollute less and we pay to clean up our mess, because nobody wants to be remembered for wrecking the planet when we had one last chance to protect it for our kids. Thank you very much, everybody, and good night.
Thank you.